from the perspective of running the business of a recording studio, how have things changed in New York City since you started in the 70s?
Well, one thing that seems sort of similar now as when I started is that there really aren't that many kind of viable recording studios because a lot have shut down. So there was a point there when there was like a glut of recording studios, and now, other than like home studios or people doing stuff in like rehearsal spaces, yeah, there's a glut of that. But like dedicated recording studios, it's almost like when I started, where like there's like 3 or something or 4. Like when I started, there was like 2 in Brooklyn, Coyote Sound in Williamsburg, and me here in Gowanus. I think there was also a place in Red Hook. So yeah, 3. And now we're down to like, well, there's me, and then there's like Studio G in Greenpoint, and maybe 1 or 2 others, or 3, or so it's not a lot. So as far as a business, that's sort of, as long as I have something to offer, it's kind of good. So people that need or want something really, it's about like personality and like a sort of X factor that as long as I maintain that, then there's enough people that are interested. So it's an interesting dynamic, because now that you can do everything at home and everyone can do a lot very impressive work at home, then why would you need me? And usually the answer is sort of an X factor, personality in the sound or in the something a bit. So everyone's interested in standing out, right? So there is a sense of, in the recording, especially no matter what, people put their blood, sweat, and tears into. So it's expensive. Either making a record it's expensive either emotionally or financially or whatever. So they want something distinctive that's going to stand out. That everyone wants to sort of stand out. No one wants homogeneity, right? So looking at a computer, they maybe would rather look at like this space. So that's kind of what's interesting. I think when there was a glut of recording studios, which was more, I don't know, in the late 90s, when like Brooklyn became more of a hot place where there was a lot of creatives moving here. Yeah, it's weird. But the business was okay as a studio, but that's when I actually considered kind of closing. Like there was a minute there where I was like, just reevaluating. Do I really want to, like tether my life to a space and to, because I'm an artist. Like if I was just starting, if this environment was what I started with, is that what I would do with my path? Would I get into the recording business? Because it really seemed very exciting in the beginning, right? Again, because it was rare, it was hard to, a lot of music that I was loving at the time barely got recorded. The only, like, especially talk about no wave, right? What were some of the initial no wave recordings? A lot of it was just like 2 mics in a room, right? So there wasn't really, and there was no standard of what that might sound like. So it was really like open to like imagining. So in some ways it's very simple. The bottom line is also like imagining new sounds and trying to reinvent genres. And I think people are down for that. Like they want to find their own niche sonically, because it's ultimately sound art, right? So the music is live, and then sound art is recording, right? So where do the brushstrokes go? Do we do it more? Is it a little on the Baroque side, like more embellishments, or like too much, or like less, less vocal harmonies, all this stuff? So it's really sound art. But yeah, it was the weird period was like at the beginning of like Napster and all that stuff, the whole downloading thing before albums came back. Because really albums sort of came back with who I owe a debt of gratitude to whoever imagined that vinyl could be a thing again. It could be a niche and could be something that people get excited about. Because the whole talk in the early aughts was, I guess it's just singles. People aren't even downloading full albums. They're just downloading individual songs. Then if you're not making albums, then why should I have a recording studio? So it was weird in the early aughts. That's when there was almost a break. So it's funny how now it almost seems like the model I got used to is kind of come back. Also, just as far as my recording studio, the longevity I realized has value. Like and I'm not into like throwing away valuable things, right? So also people value it. They like coming to a place that's been around for a long time instead of like in some new building, new development. It's like an old school. We're in a factory making an old, slightly decrepit, old factory space. It was sort of an abandoned factory space when I moved here in 1979, but still of that nature. So yeah, that's kind of the path of the studio as a business.
You just recorded our album earlier this year, and that's going to be coming out. Well, album, it's an EP, really, 5 songs, more Martian now than Man, which is going to be coming out later this year. And so we're independent, right? We're an independent band, self-funded, no label, and all of that. When you're talking about the evolution and how in the beginning there were really only a couple of studios and a lot of the no-wave stuff, it was just DIY, 2 mics kind of a thing. I'd imagine your early clients, maybe they had record labels, maybe most of them now, maybe most of them don't. Like how has your average client changed over the years?
Yeah, well, one thing that's really strange is there was a lot of small labels. And the reason was that there was an economy that we now take for granted, and we took for granted then, like a basic economy that made it possible, like not a completely money-losing prospect for someone that was a music fan, or maybe they were an artist themselves, a little more business acumen or whatever, or had some vision that they could start a label. Usually I think people start a label because they see a whole dimension of music that they would like to support. Sometimes it's just the community. If you take a label like Discord, I forget when it started, I guess in the early 80s or whatever, from Washington, D.C., they were like immersed in this, culture with the emerging hardcore scene or whatever. And so they had a vision in Discord of like a community based. It was very much for Washington, D.C., right? That label, Discord. There was some Manhattan labels like Glenn Branca's label, I think it was called Neutral or whatever. So he had a vision too. So I think that it was easier then, just because of how distribution worked, and access to music to venture that way without completely like losing your shirt. And it's because it's funny because just the main thing in terms of like access to music. I remember that when I wanted to hear music that I'd heard of, I'd actually just to hear it, I'd have to go to a record store and buy it. And that did not seem strange to me. It did not seem strange to me to go, oh, I heard of this band. I'll see if they have it here. I guess I'll have to buy the record. Just even hear it. Or there's times if I had a little party and then I was like, oh, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe even my friends that are coming, maybe they would like to hear the new Laughing Hyenas record. I guess I'll go buy it, just enough figuring, oh, there's an opportunity to maybe pick up some new music. So there was much more of an economy of that. And so people could be assured that with a little bit of promotion, that people would just buy the music and buy the record. So distributors would, they would usually hold they would hold a certain amount, like a 20% for returns, right? So stuff that wasn't sold from stores, but that shows you. So they'd ship out like a batch of records, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000, and they would actually expect reasonably that 80% of those would sell, and there was money. So it was just not controversial at all in those dollars from that era to sign with a small label and get an advance of $1,000. That was not crazy. That was just normal. And now seems, and that's in those dollars. That's probably worth like $3,000 now. Now that's kind of unheard of. So just the easier money that it was made it more easy for people to have labels, to the point that I knew I didn't do any self-released recordings. There was always a label. It just was kind of a tiny label, so it was someone's friend or something like that. So anyone who was enough of a fan that had some vision of how like they could contribute, and there was some big picture of like the kind of curation they would do for their label, would just kind of do it. So, and there was a demand because musicians were like famously, as we know, just sort of not really in the business and not understanding publishing. So there would be someone that would kind of take that lead, and there would be people that were willing. So it's funny, people are willing, but if you put like a big financial block there, that's not going to happen. So it's been bad for artists in that way. But interesting, that's completely different than the way it used to be.
Did you have more clients then? Do you have more now? Is it about the same? I wonder how's the volume changed?
I had, it seems like less clients, but people would spend a lot longer in the studio. So things, I mean, just very different. Now that I think back on it, I don't even understand how it all worked because I was more expensive because I had a lot more analog gear. There was also an expectation, that would all be maintained. I would have like a person usually on Sunday morning come here, tech like once a week or once every 2 weeks, and that cost a few $100 just to come and align the tape machines and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I suppose all studios did that. That was just the standard. Like I said earlier, there wasn't that many recording studios. So I'd have a tech that comes Sunday morning, and that was that person's day where they would go to all this, like a couple other studios and do all the tech, and so that's expensive. I charged more. I charge less now, strangely. But also, so yeah, records were expensive to make, more expensive, really. Like now you can make a record cheaper. Back then, was like, yeah, you'd be paying $5,000 to $10,000 in those dollars then to make the record, and it took time, but yet you would make money off the record, so it wasn't that much of a risk. So you would do it, but maybe as you're making that record, you got an advance from like the tiny little label for 1,000 or maybe 2,000 or 1,500. Then that helps. And then you can expect that once the record comes out 6 months later, the label gets their check from the distributor, and then you get another 1,500. So it just really helped matters. But really, projects took a lot longer to do. So, for instance, mixing. It was for a really important song. It was not controversial at all to spend 2 days, and what I called days then. This was before the music wellness trend where we want to like treat ourselves physically and emotionally well as musicians. Back then, no one gave a damn, and the whole idea was if you're not bleeding on the floor and your mind completely blown apart, you're not serious, right? So we would just like basically just I thought nothing of just making my mind numb with like a series of like 12, 13, 14-hour days. So that seemed like that's the way you do things.
Just lock the door and push through.
Just good. And it was unhealthy and stuff, but just didn't think that way. Also, just generally things were just less healthy. But so the 12, 13-hour days, 2 of them in the studio for a song that was important was not controversial. And now, I mean, that occasionally happens still. But the expectation is just much faster work because a lot of things are easier. One thing that people assume, by the way, about that era, it was that we didn't fix things. People thought, it was all live. It was all like because you couldn't fix things. There was no undo. That's not true, actually. We did a lot of fixing. It's just that the fixing took time, and we would have to like actually decide. Like sometimes we would actually have to make a choice. Okay, we could fix that bass note. That's going to take 20 minutes to fix. Should we skip it or not? And then half the time, thankfully, the answer would be no, we're just going to leave it. But then sometimes, no, that's actually important, or like to do an edit between 2 takes on analog tape, and I'd have to shuffle the tape between 2 reels and then do the thing, and then with a razor blade and have a little bit of like, it's funny when the concept of undo didn't exist. I was a lot braver. I was more brave then about taking a razor blade to, I could completely fuck up, 7 hours of work with just one slice wrong in the wrong spot or something. That didn't scare me off. So it was just that you just got used to. That's how you got to do things. It's a lot of risk. But anyway, that takes time is my point. So we did fix things, and we did. People assume, we did it fast because there wasn't the means. No, we did it slow. We still spent a lot of time. Maybe the mixes wouldn't be automated, so we would do 5 mixes, and then we'd splice between them. Like we would do we just fly on mixes and go, well, you know what? The bridge was really good on that 4th mix. And then because we'd have like maybe more hands on deck on the like board. So that'd be time. Then we go, okay, let's get a dinner break and we'll go back, listen to all the mixes, and then splice together. Like we got the verses really good in this one because someone decided to push up the bass drum. This kind of stuff, really on the fly. And then we go, okay, you know what? We didn't really get an intro. Okay, let's just stop, worry about the intro. 7 hours later, right?
Yeah.
Now that's like 20 minutes of work or half an hour or something.
Right.
So yeah, that's the difference. 3-month records. So less clients, more time, more money.
Yeah, big differences, it seems like, and now recordings are almost more. It's like how do you justify it? It's almost like as marketing, but because you're not going to make money back on it for the most part, like not in the actual recording. But I want to move to your musician side of your career, and you mentioned, well, everybody used to have a label. Now nobody does. And you and I had a conversation once, and I was asking you about your band, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that and about this idea that you explained to me. Like, you think of it like you're the label. There's no label supporting. So you have this group of musicians, and you set up the tours. You do the promotion, and I mean, could you talk a little bit about that kind of concept, if you recall that conversation?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I try to remind myself when I'm losing money that I'm acting as my own label. So that helps me to justify in my brain losing money because, like, for instance, the thing that people might not understand was that touring was always a money-losing proposition until you broke or until you got more established, right? So there was no expectation that you could just launch into touring without reaching that threshold and make money or even break even. So record labels had to, and this was usually part of the agreement with labels, maybe bigger labels than the sort of, like small personal labels I was talking about before. So at least slightly bigger labels. Tour support was in that. So the idea was that the label would offset a totally money-losing proposition to get you on the road. Right. So like they'd buy you your van, and then they'd give you a per diem, like each member would have a per diem, I don't know, whatever, 30, 40, 50 bucks a day just for food. And so the label would do that. But then, of course, the idea was that they understood, which is true, that touring helps sell records, and then they'd make the money back with the records sold. Right, so they could distributors would order more hard copies of records if they knew a band was on tour, and they would usually like match it and pitch it to stores that were along the tour route. And as soon as barcodes came around, with SoundScan as they called it, I forget the year exactly, but as soon as barcodes came around, what people had just been assuming but no one had any evidence of was proven, that touring sells records, right? So they could see where the records were sold and when, and they could see that if you were going to play in a particular town, there was proof now that the record would sell a few days before you played, because actually, unless someone heard the song on college radio or something like that, they're not going to know what you sound like. So sometimes people would just be curious. Oh, this band's coming to town. I guess I'll have to buy the record to hear what they sound like. So they would sell a few records, and then actually maybe a few people saw you or talked about it or something. Then a few days after, or like they had buyer's regret or non-buyer's regret that they didn't or couldn't, because people wouldn't necessarily be so focused on merch back then. Even, right? So now labels think that the whole game is to like load up the artist with actual copies that they take on tour with them, that's how it works. That's what labels rely on, because that's a proven kind of more interesting way for people to consume and buy records. So when I'm losing money on touring, I just remind myself, well, that's what happens. There is no other way until I get more established. The question is then to try to strategize to get more established in some way, and there's a few different angles, but it's super difficult. I also try to relax because it's always been super difficult. The only thing that's changed is really that it was just easier because there was a little more money along the way for different things. Like I said, people bought records that padded everything, but it still was always difficult. When people actually broke, everyone was shocked because it just didn't happen. Right. And in fact, when people started getting signed for labels, the signing frenzies of the like early 90s, for instance, and mid 90s, like labels would sign easily a dozen bands and then drop 11 of those bands, right? So always difficult. Tough business. Like, can I quote Hunter Thompson? You know the quote, right?
I don't know.
Something, I paraphrase, the music business is a long, unforgiving corridor lined with pimps and thieves, and there's also a dark side. So something like that. And I was like, wow. So that's like, when did he say that? Like in the 60s or something. So it's always, even in the high rolling times, it was always, like, as he said, a torturous, like, alley where you're just going to get assaulted and mugged and robbed. So
if I can get philosophical for a second, since you brought up Hunter S. Thompson, why do we keep doing this, Martin? We're losing money. It's painful. It's all these hours. It's all this blood, sweat, and tears. It's not only expensive, as you said, financially, but also emotionally. Why do we keep doing it?
yeah, well, actually, what's funny with me with the there was a minute there recently in the last 5 years when maybe the last decade, when I realized I was almost a little bit of a canary in a coal mine where I could almost like gauge the economy, right? When things were about to go bad, like when we have a looming depression, the first thing that goes is people spending money on their music. So like that band or whatever is just going to look at like not blowing their wad, right, basically. So I'll notice, I'm like, oh, wow, business is down a little. There's less interest or, there's less. I'm like, oh, the economy's starting to go south, right? Those are the first sign. So music is the first one to go in terms of people spending. But then I noticed on the other side of that, when the economy was about to improve, or, there's not a lot of official evidence of it, but there might be some anecdotal, like it's starting a little bit of silver lining around the clouds, little light on the horizon, the dawn is approaching.
Your phone starts to ring.
Then the first thing, people are jumping in, like eager to jump in and spend money on music. So it's the first to go, but when things are looking good, it's the first that they're going to like sink their like emotional and financial resources into. So that's the thing. There's some frigging magic. And also, interestingly enough, is because occasionally I do see that also with, even though there's a lot less labels, still there's the occasional small label that happens. That also happens with people that might consider starting a label. It's like, that's a dream too. I mean, there are people, I'm surprised when I speak to people like this, actually, because I don't really get owning a label as a dream. But yet, strangely, there are people that's their like heartfelt and thankful. I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that there are people that can get just super excited about supporting music and supporting artists and feel somehow they can like facilitate a vision and be part of a musical community and because we need all hands on deck and people and that's always what I thought community was, just people with different, not everyone doing the same thing, but people with different skills, right? So to bring into it and help build and sustain the community, right? So also that's the thing is I realized that that's as much as it might be a dream. A lot of things, a dream to make music or to do it on your own terms, or a dream just to perform. I'm glad that some people are narcissists, that all they want to do is just get up there and like be watched. Great. So that's our front person. So I'm glad for that too. And I'm glad for the person that their dream is to just help make shit happen, But I realize that then when the economy starts looming a little bit better, then those people come out of the woodwork. People are willing to take a little more of a financial risk. So music is a big dream. I guess that's what I was kind of saying. It really occupies a special place. I wish there was more research really about, or at least I haven't come across it, of like what happens in the brain, where did music come from, when did it originate in our evolution? Because I do think of it as language. I think the thing that struck me is I was reading about dolphins and how people that study dolphins find their language super impressive because they can like communicate holograms and stuff like that, right? They can communicate holographically, whereas you and I might strain to give someone directions of like, well, you get to the third house and you make a left at the end of the park. The dolphin can just transmit a friggin' map, right? So that's pretty sophisticated. And then I realized, well, it's funny because us humans, especially as a musician, we can transmit emotions, right? So I can communicate, I can communicate like how I feel. I was like, you can say, how do you feel, Martin? I'll go, let me play a song. Then you can get the emotion, anger or longing or alienation. I can communicate these emotions. That's pretty powerful. And if I can get lucky and actually make someone feel those emotions, like I can make someone feel longing, or I can make someone angry or so I can summon these emotions. I mean, that's fantastic. So it's really communication. And I'm convinced that there's a part of the brain that really is dedicated to that. I just never see anything. I mean, we talk about the language center, where we talk about the music center. It must be there. That's why some musicians think that music predates language. I'm not sure it's true, but I'm just saying I heard that mentioned by musicians, and actually I think it is interesting. Maybe it's the first language. But also look at just dumb stuff like we know at these stores that people like open up their pockets and buy more if you play music. This kind of stuff, right? Like what is that?
Right. I
we
think
know it's true, but why? How?
I've heard some evolutionary biologists wrestle with this question, and I think the prevailing wisdom for a long time was that music was just like auditory cheesecake is the term that I heard, like this thing that's not really essential, but it's really nice, like cheesecake. You don't need to eat cheesecake, but you really enjoy it when you have it. But clearly, there's more to it than that. And I think that's Daniel Levitin has a book about that where he kind of tries to explore it a little bit. He's like a music psychologist because like you're saying, music does a lot more than just it's much more than just kind of fun and pleasant, which it can be, but it's also this communication tool, like you said.
Yeah. Also, I think it has a lot to do with sort of a strong underpinning of culture and society. So probably a lot of people over our 250,000 years of existence probably thought of music as a way to bring people together and stuff like that. So that it would be encouraged so there was social music for dancing, music for spiritual music, music for fucking, basically, right? So it's a part of making society work. So I think that's why, in a way, with musician and maybe art in general, I guess, but it feels that way with music that you're connecting to. But it really helps community, right? So that's what I mean. Sometimes, actually, in touring in Europe, where I really started getting that sense of like, wow, we're like this like alternate state, and I mean like state, like nation state, right? We're like I have more in common musically with someone that we share a musical language that might not even particularly speak English, or maybe not speak English at all, but I can tell by how they're dressed or what shows they go to, or who, that's like, well, so I'm actually much more of the same tribe as this person that's actually not of the same tribe, right? So that's actually supersedes. So I think that there's a real sense of that, of power. I mean, I really came into really believing in being part of music. So maybe answering your question of, well, why the blood, sweat, and tears? Like, because I remember the 60s, and strange as it is, I remember like 1968. My dad was a doctor in the East Village, right? So and my parents used to maybe twice a week go for dinner in the West Village, right? So that was right in the hot seat of like the folk revolution, of the hippie folk West Village revolution, and the East Village, we'd go there. And I completely, 100% as a kid, thought music was an essential part of social change. Like I really saw that as more of because everything was sort of culturally revolutionary then, right? Like actually we thought real revolution was coming, and people thought, spiritual revolution was coming, and the age of Aquarius, and, but it seemed like in all that, how people looked was, how people looked. It's also shifted a little. It shifted less than the music. The music was the most novel thing about even the whole counterculture. That seemed like you want to explain the music, forget about the picture of someone. It would be like the music. So I really had a sense of that. So music as important cultural change and power culturally. It always seemed like that was the bottom line. In fact, with a lot of the punks, where I started kind of get more involved with punks when I came into of age, I thought a lot of us were jealous of the 60s, right? Because the 60s was like the music was just like powerful and like changing the planet. And then suddenly it was relegated to like like a little niche in the shadows and much smaller, right? Like the whole Generation X of the punks was just a smaller generation. It was just less people of that age than like the baby boomers. So it actually felt kind of diminished. I felt there was some jealousy. I even thought that's why punks were so anti-hippie. They were just jealous. That was my sense of it. It's funny because I went on a tour with this band Gong, who was like a psychedelic band from the the psychedelic scene in Great Britain, in London and stuff like that. And there was a manager who's this famous guy, George Gomelski, well, famous for being a manager, who used to manage the Yardbirds, and then was as part of his lore is that he helped the Rolling Stones form and knew. Anyway, so he would come on this tour. I went on an actual tour. I was still in high school, and I went on a tour as a roadie. And I remember he would sometimes do a little speech at the beginning, and then his final quote at the end of his little speech was, he quoted someone who I forget who it is, was, "When the music changes, beware because the city walls are about to fall." So that was the thing. So kind of
Sounds
memorable.
like Confucius or Plato.
Something. It's some ancient shit, right? That's like kind of when walls had cities had walls, right? So, but someone said that, and yeah. So music has power, I guess.
So we're a little bit over time, but I just wanted to ask you one more question, which is, I was thinking about this on the way here. You know, your career started in the 1970s, and things you've talked about here, the music business has changed a lot. So I guess in the 70s, you were late teenager, early 20s, whatever. If you're that age now, or if you met yourself that age now, what advice do you give 20-year-old Martin Bisi? Do you advise yourself to go on the same path musically that you have done or that you did then, or would you give advice to do things a little bit differently?
Well, I think as if I could advise, you mean if I could advise myself, if I could go back to the 80s or whatever, because I found making of records to be super, super exciting. So I didn't really focus on live playing. So just that's me. You know, now it's kind of obvious that nothing happens unless you play live. It wasn't that obvious then. You know, like even the label I was on for a minute, which was called New Alliance, which was like a subsidiary of SST, I kind of realized thinking about it, it was like, oh, this is the label for artists that don't tour, right? Which I wasn't doing. And then I kind of, but even that was possible. So even like not touring, just putting out, just making music and just sending it, that there was even a way to release that music even without touring. But that didn't get me far. Nothing need to go far, but I wish I would have worked more on playing live. So that would be, and I didn't come into that realization until the early aughts when I felt that actually the recording business was kind of going kaput. And because of the demise of records and Napster and downloading and all that kind of stuff. And I felt, well, is this even going to be exciting anymore? Everyone's got a home recording studio. Is anyone going to give a shit if they're not making albums? Do they even care about making music that sounds like art or is well made? So that's when I was like, you know what, I got to start playing live more. Just anyway, I got to do it for myself. But I think generally, as I also come from I was really influenced by a sort of Warhol culture of the time. And, you know, I don't love using words like branding or, you know, any of that stuff. But, you know, if we can kind of get away from some of the how, like if we want to get away with how loaded and narcissistic and vapid maybe self-promotion is, you know, I still think that there's something to be said because people always did it, which was like kind of defining what you're doing, finding what it is and kind of doubling down on that and then finding like-minded artists and kind of make a scene. And so really like being part of something, like that's why we had names for stuff. That's why people would say no wave, right? So that seems kind of essential. Like you're not doing this in a void. So I think playing with bands that are like you, try to make that kind of powerful, make that as much as you can a thing. There's always a threshold where people, if there's numbers, if there's enough people doing one thing, doing something a certain kind of way, inevitably people like are forced, or journalists or just observers are forced to acknowledge it. And I think there's power in that, you know, so usually when I feel like I'm connected to something, I usually cultivate it, right? So I think, you know, that's why I like opening for bigger bands where I feel that there's some commonality because what they're about then shines on me, and then it looks like, well, I'm like if they're experimental, then you might look at me and go, well, you're kind of experimental, you know. Like there's bands I didn't even know how to categorize, but I see them playing with other bands. I'm like, oh, I see they're kind of stoner. I didn't think of them as stoner, but they're opening for a stoner band. I'm like, then I hear the stoner in them or something. So really, what you're about is kind of a big deal, and to not really make music in a void. And I think sometimes when people are interested in a new artist, they're actually interested in the happening. So if it wasn't a happening, that new artist probably would not get the attention. That artist is getting the attention because they're kind of a poster child for like a bigger picture, a bigger happening that's happening in music or society. And then that's the artist that people like focus in on. So, and then it's funny because I feel sometimes it's like it's a fold 'em or hold 'em, where like there's times it's like, okay, it's good to find like a sort of defining characteristic in this thing that's happening. And there's a point where you got to pull the plug. So that's in my life, I've found that a lot, where there's bits where I'm like, oh, okay, I'll go down this path and I'm part of this musical community. And then sometimes I'm like, you know what, this is dead. And it's getting boring, and it's actually getting worse, which is inevitable. Things age, right? And so then I'm like, you know what? I need to just pull out and just redefine myself. And then, but the importance or the risk really of being too closely associated with one thing, or maybe you want. So it's always that sort of, in a way, I don't want to make it an intellectual calculation. I want it to come from the heart. But going with that, and I think that matters. So you always got to be part of something, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, which comes back to what you're talking about with the communal aspect of music.
Yeah.
Right? It's about a community. It's not just in a vacuum.
And it's about a language. There's people that like in my sort of liking free jazz, and then some of my friends say, but it's kind of unlistenable, isn't it? And then I'm like, I've said this is actually it's going to come out of my mouth again. There's something to be said for unlistenable, like I'll kind of, because it's unlistenable to you, but then to other people, it's a language. So that's also our little tribe. So it's like people like I know can sound like complete mayhem, but some people go, oh yeah, that was kind of cool. And other people are like, what are you guys listening to? It's like, that's actually a good thing. So I don't mind a little tribalism with music. That's where I think it should go. So, there should be the goths, and they can paint their faces, and other people go, oh God, I don't want to do that. Okay, good. Do something else.
All right, cool. Well, we're at time. I think it's a good place to stop.
Okay, well, thank you, Ryan. Really appreciate it. And thanks to any listeners out there.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin Bisi of BC Studio.
Thank you.